they said when Aurelius stood on the auction block that morning in 1851. Grown men wept, without knowing why. Women turned their faces away, clutching their pearls as if they'd seen something holy, something terrible. The richest plantation owners in New Orleans had come to bid on him, drawn by rumors of his unprecedented beauty. But when the moment arrived, not a single hand rose. Not because they didn't want him, but because when he looked at them, really looked at them, they saw themselves as they truly were, and it was unbearable. His chains lay empty on the platform, still locked, but somehow opened from the inside. Aurelius had vanished, and those who'd met his gaze began seeing him everywhere, in every reflection, in every shadow, always with the same knowing expression. The question everyone whispered was simple but haunting. What had he seen in them that made them so afraid? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning began as all auction mornings did in the French Quarter, with the metallic clang of chains and the shuffling of bare feet on cobblestones. Steam rose from the Mississippi River like the breath of ghosts, curling through the narrow streets, where merchants already hawked their wares, and free people of color hurried past, with their eyes lowered. The Vieux Carré smelled of chicory coffee and rotting fruit, of perfume and sewage, of money and desperation, all mixed together into the particular scent that defined New Orleans in the years before the war that would tear the nation apart. Madame Celestine Beaumont stood at her window on Rue Royale, watching the crowds move toward the Street Louis Exchange. She was 63 years old, dressed in black silk, as she had been every day since her husband died 12 years prior, and she had attended more slave auctions than she cared to count. Her plantation, Belle Rive, sprawled across 3,000 acres north of the city, producing sugar cane that filled the bellies of half of Europe with sweetness. She owned 147 souls, as the ledgers coldly recorded them, and she had never once hesitated to acquire another if the investment seemed sound. But today felt different. The air itself seemed charged with something she couldn't name, a tension that made her jewelry feel heavier on her skin. Her lady's maid, Josephine, a woman of mixed heritage who had served the Beaumont family for 3 decades, stood behind her with a troubled expression that Celestine caught in the window's reflection. "You feel it too," Celestine said, not turning around. It was not a question. Josephine's hands stilled on the brush she'd been using to arrange her mistress's silver hair. "I don't know what you mean, madame." "Don't lie to me, Josephine. We've known each other too long for that courtesy." Celestine turned from the window, studying the face of the woman who had been with her through births and deaths, through prosperity and grief. "Everyone in the quarter is talking about this man, this Aurelius. They say he's unlike anything ever brought to market." Josephine resumed her brushing, but her movements were mechanical, distracted. "They say many things, madam. Most of them prove to be exaggerations designed to drive up the price. They say he was educated in secret by his previous owner's wife, that he speaks 5 languages, that he's read more books than most white men will encounter in their lifetimes." Celestine watched Josephine's face carefully. "They say his beauty is such that it causes pain to look at him for too long, like staring into the sun." "Beauty is common enough," Josephine replied, but her voice held an edge of something that might have been fear. "It won't help him now." Celestine reached up and caught Josephine's wrist, holding it firmly but without cruelty. "What aren't you telling me?" Josephine met her eyes for a long moment, And in that gaze, Celestine saw decades of unspoken understanding, of boundaries carefully maintained and just as carefully transgressed when necessary. My cousin's husband works at the holding pens, where they keep them before the auctions. He says this one is different. Says the other captives won't go near him, won't even look at him. Not out of fear exactly, but something else. Respect, maybe, or recognition. Recognition of what? Josephine pulled her wrist free gently and set down the brush. Of something that shouldn't be in chains. That's what he said. Anyway, that this Aurelius fellow looks at you and you understand, really understand for the first time in your life, what it means to own another person. What it costs you, even if you never have to pay. Celestine turned back to the window, watching the crowds thicken on the streets below. She had built her fortune on the labor of human beings, bought and sold like cattle, had justified it to herself through scripture and economic necessity, and the simple fact that this was the way things were and had always been. She slept soundly most nights, her conscience clear because she told herself she was kinder than most, that her slaves were well fed and rarely whipped, that she was acting within the bounds of civilized society as it existed. But sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, she wondered what her husband had seen in those final moments before fever took him. He had gripped her hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Celestine, when you stand before God, what will you say? What will you say?" She had never told anyone about those words, had pushed them down deep where they couldn't trouble her daily life. Now, looking at the crowds moving toward the auction house, she felt those words rising up again like water through a cracked foundation. "I'm going to see him," she said suddenly. "This, Aurelius. I'm going to attend the auction." "Madame, you never attend the auctions yourself. You send Monsieur Devoe to bid for you. Today I will attend personally." Celestine moved toward her wardrobe, selecting her finest day dress, a confection of emerald silk that had cost more than most people earned in a year. "If this man is truly as remarkable as they say, I want to see for myself. Besides, I grow bored of sending proxies to make my decisions. Perhaps it's time I faced the source of my wealth directly." Josephine said nothing, but her silence was eloquent with disapproval and something deeper, a sorrow that seemed to encompass not just this moment, but all the moments that had led to it, and all those that would follow. By the time Celestine's carriage arrived at the Street Louis Exchange, the building was surrounded by a crowd unlike any she had seen at previous auctions. The usual assortment of plantation owners and slave traders was present, certainly, but they were joined by people who seemed to have come merely to witness whatever spectacle was promised. Street vendors sold meat pies and pralines to spectators who jostled for position near the entrance. Artists had set up their easels, hoping to capture the face of this legendary beauty for posterity. Even the prostitutes from the Storyville district had come, their painted faces bright in the morning sun, whispering among themselves and casting curious glances at the auction house doors. Celestine made her way through the crowd with the authority of her class and station, her presence causing people to part before her like water before the prow of a ship. Inside, the auction house was packed to capacity, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, expensive cologne, and nervous sweat. The usual items were being sold first, farm equipment and furniture and barrels of molasses, but no one was paying attention to these proceedings. Every eye was fixed on the curtained area at the back of the stage where the human merchandise was kept before being brought forward. She found a seat in the second row, a position that would allow her to see clearly, without being so close that she would be expected to bid first. Around her, the cream of New Orleans society had gathered, faces she recognized from balls and dinner parties and church services. There was Philippe Devereaux, whose plantation adjoined her own, a cruel man who was known to work his slaves to death and then purchase replacements with the casualness of someone buying new shoes. There was Judge Armand Leblanc, who had sentenced runaways to hangings and floggings from his bench for 30 years without a single visible moment of hesitation. There were merchants and bankers and shipping magnates, all men who had built their fortunes on the bodies of the enslaved, all now fidgeting in their seats like schoolboys waiting for a magic show to begin. The regular auction droned on for another hour, various men and women and children being brought forth and displayed, their teeth checked and their muscles prodded, while the auctioneer called out their supposed qualities in a voice that suggested he was selling horses rather than human beings. Celestine had seen it all before, had participated in it all before, but today each moment seemed to last an eternity, each casual cruelty magnified somehow, as if she were seeing it all with fresh eyes that couldn't quite reconcile what was happening with any sense of human decency. Finally, as the church bells struck 11, the auctioneer cleared his throat and held up his hands for silence. The effect was immediate and absolute. The packed room fell so quiet that Celestine could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer began, and even his voice sounded different now, uncertain in a way that professional slave traders never allowed themselves to be. "What I am about to present to you is, without question, the most extraordinary lot ever to pass through these doors. I ask that you remain calm and orderly during the proceedings. We will begin the bidding at $5,000. A murmur ran through the crowd. $5,000 was an enormous sum, enough to purchase a dozen strong field hands or a highly skilled craftsman with years of training. To start the bidding, there suggested something truly exceptional, or a seller with an inflated sense of his merchandise's value. The auctioneer nodded to an assistant, who moved to the curtain and pulled it back slowly, as if revealing a painting in a gallery. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Aurelius stepped forward onto the platform, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Celestine had been prepared for beauty. The rumors had promised beauty, but what stood before her transcended that word entirely, made it small and inadequate, like trying to describe the ocean by calling it wet. Aurelius was tall, perhaps 6 feet and 2 inches, with skin the color of burnished copper that seemed to glow with an inner light in the dim auction house. His features were perfectly symmetrical, as if sculpted by an artist who had spent years getting every detail precisely right. High cheekbones, full lips, a jaw that could have been carved from marble. His hair was dark and curled close to his head, and he wore the simple white shirt and trousers that all auction slaves wore. But on him they looked like royal garments. But it was his eyes that captured Celestine's attention and held it with a grip like iron. They were dark, so dark they seemed almost black in certain lights, with flecks of gold that caught the lamplight and glittered like distant stars. And when those eyes swept across the crowd, Celestine felt something she had not felt in decades. She felt seen, truly seen. Stripped of all her careful social masks and expensive clothes and accumulated justifications, reduced to the essential truth of what she was and what she had done. She wanted to look away. God, how she wanted to look away. But she found she could not, any more than she could have stopped her heart from beating or her lungs from drawing breath. Aurelius's gaze moved through the crowd methodically, touching each face for just a moment, and wherever it landed, people reacted. Some gasped. Some covered their faces with their hands. Philippe Devereaux, that brutal man who feared nothing, let out a small whimper and turned his face to the wall. Judge Leblanc stood up as if to leave, then sat down again heavily, his face drained of all color. When those eyes finally found Celestine, she felt the full weight of them, like a physical force. In that instant, she saw herself as he must see her, a woman who had spent her entire life benefiting from the suffering of others, who had justified atrocity through comfort and custom, who had allowed herself to believe that kindness could somehow balance the fundamental wrong of owning another human being. She saw her husband's final question written in Aurelius's gaze. What will you say? What will you say? What will you say? And she had no answer except the terrible silence of her own complicity. Tears began to stream down her face without her permission, hot and shameful tears that blurred her vision and ran down her carefully powdered cheeks to stain her emerald dress. Around her, she heard similar sounds of distress, men clearing their throats roughly, women sobbing quietly into their handkerchiefs, the rustling of bodies shifting in profound discomfort. The auctioneer's voice broke the spell, or tried to. As you can see, this is a specimen of truly remarkable quality, educated, healthy, strong, suitable for house service or any position requiring intelligence and discretion. Do I hear $5,000? $5,000 to start the bidding? Silence. No one raised a hand. No one spoke. The crowd sat frozen, caught between desire and an inexplicable terror that seemed to grow with every passing second. 4,000 then, the auctioneer said, and now there was definite nervousness in his voice. Surely someone is willing to bid 4,000 for such a fine specimen. 3,000. Come now, gentlemen, ladies. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Still nothing. Celestine found her voice, or thought she did, tried to speak the number that would begin the bidding, but when she opened her mouth, no sound emerged. It was as if her voice had been stolen, as if some force beyond her understanding had reached down her throat and taken away her ability to participate in this particular transaction. Aurelius had not moved since stepping onto the platform. He stood perfectly still, his face serene and somehow sad, like a priest watching his congregation fail a test they didn't know they were taking. His eyes continued their slow sweep of the room, and wherever they landed, people flinched away or stared back in fascinated horror. 2,000, the auctioneer was saying now, desperation creeping into his tone. $1,500. Surely someone will bid $500. Philippe Devereaux stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I'll give you 1,000, he said, but his voice was shaking. $1,000. Let's be done with this. The auctioneer looked relieved. Thank you, Monsieur Devereaux. I have $1,000. Do I hear 1,500? But before anyone could respond, Aurelius turned his full attention to Devereaux. He didn't speak, didn't gesture, simply looked at the man with an intensity that seemed to burn through the air between them. Devereaux staggered as if he'd been struck, his hand going to his chest, his face twisted in pain or recognition or both, and then he was pushing through the crowd toward the exit, shoving people aside in his haste to escape, making small wounded sounds like an animal caught in a trap. The room erupted in confusion. People began standing, moving toward the doors, their faces pale and stricken. The auctioneer was shouting for order, but no one was listening anymore. The spell had been broken, or perhaps it had been completed, and now the only imperative was to get away from those eyes, from that knowing gaze that saw too much and reflected it back with a clarity that was unendurable. Celestine remained in her seat, even as people streamed past her toward the exits. She felt rooted to the spot, unable to move, watching as Aurelius watched her back with an expression that might have been pity or forgiveness or simple acknowledgement. In that moment, she understood that this man, this enslaved person who by all the laws of the land and the customs of society should have been powerless, held more true power than anyone in this room. Not the power to force or compel, but the power to reveal, to strip away illusion and force confrontation with truth. "Madame," a voice said beside her, and she turned to find Josephine there, having somehow made her way through the chaos. "Madame, we should go." "Yes," Celestine whispered. But as she stood, she looked back one more time at Aurelius. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture that could have been a bow or a nod or a farewell, and then she was being guided through the thinning crowd toward the door, toward the sunlight and the street and the world that continued on despite everything that had just transpired. By that evening, the story of the failed auction had spread throughout New Orleans like wildfire, in the gambling houses and brothels, in the fine restaurants and shabby taverns, in the parlors of the wealthy and the cramped quarters of the poor. People spoke of nothing else. The accounts varied in their details, but agreed on the essentials. A man of extraordinary beauty had been brought to auction, and somehow his mere presence had rendered the entire proceeding impossible. Some said he had supernatural powers. Others claimed he was an angel sent to judge the wicked. A few whispered that he was something older and darker, a spirit from African traditions that had survived the Middle Passage and now walked among them wearing human skin. The truth, as Celestine would later reflect, was both simpler and more complex than any of these explanations. Aurelius had done nothing except exist and look at people, but in that looking, in that simple act of meeting eyes with those who claimed ownership over human beings, he had forced a confrontation that most people spent their entire lives avoiding. He had asked without words the question that her dying husband had asked: "What will you say? What will you say when all the justifications are stripped away and you stand naked before the truth of what you have done?" That night, Celestine sat in her study with a glass of brandy she didn't drink, staring at the ledgers that recorded the names and values of the people she owned. She had inherited most of them from her husband, had purchased others over the years as her business expanded, and had never questioned the fundamental rightness of this arrangement. It was legal. It was economically necessary. It was sanctioned by church and state and every respectable authority she could name. But now, remembering those eyes, she questioned everything. She thought about Josephine, who had been born on this plantation and had never known freedom, who served her with apparent devotion but who must harbor thoughts and feelings that Celestine had never bothered to explore. She thought about the field workers whose names she barely knew, who toiled under the sun to produce the wealth that kept her in silk dresses and fine brandy. She thought about the children born into bondage, growing up knowing they were property, that their bodies and their futures and even their children belonged to someone else. The weight of it settled on her shoulders like a physical burden, so heavy she could barely breathe. How had she never felt this before? How had she moved through the world so easily, so comfortably, while building her life on such a foundation of suffering? The answer, she realized with sick clarity, was that she had never truly looked. She had never allowed herself to see the people she owned as fully human, had maintained a careful distance that made exploitation possible. Aurelius had destroyed that distance in a single glance, had forced her to see and to feel and to know, and she would never be able to unknow it. She was still sitting there when Josephine came in to extinguish the lamps for the night. The older woman paused in the doorway, taking in Celestine's stillness, the untouched brandy, the ledgers spread across the desk. "Madame, sit down, Josephine," Celestine said quietly. "Please, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." Josephine hesitated, then moved to perch carefully on the edge of a chair, maintaining the posture of a servant even in this moment of strange intimacy. "Yes, Madame, if you could be free, truly free, what would you do? Where would you go?" The question hung in the air between them, dangerous and forbidden and necessary. Josephine's face went through a series of expressions, shock and suspicion, and something that might have been hope, before settling into careful neutrality. "Madame, I don't think such questions serve any purpose. Answer me anyway. Please, I need to know." Josephine was quiet for a long time, so long that Celestine thought she might not respond at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "I have a daughter. Did you know that? Of course you didn't, because you've never asked about my life before I came here. She was sold away from me when she was 8 years old. That was 32 years ago. I don't know if she's alive or dead, if she remembers me, if she has children of her own. If I could be free, I would look for her. I would spend whatever time I have left trying to find her. And if I found her, I would hold her and tell her that I never stopped thinking about her. Not for a single day." The words landed like blows, each one stripping away another layer of Celestine's comfortable ignorance. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "Fine, sorry doesn't change anything, Madame. Sorry is just a word. You're right." Celestine looked at the ledgers, at the neat columns of figures that reduced human lives to monetary values. "You're absolutely right. But perhaps actions can change things. Perhaps it's not too late to do something different." "What are you saying?" "I don't know yet. I need time to think, to understand what I saw today, what it means." Celestine met Josephine's eyes, trying to pour into that gaze all the confused sincerity she felt. "But I can't go back to how things were. That man, Aurelius, he made it impossible to go back. Does that make sense?" It makes sense," Josephine said slowly. "But Madame, a feeling isn't the same as an action, and actions require courage. Then I will find courage, or I will die trying." The next morning brought news that electrified the city once again. Aurelius had vanished from the auction house. The guards swore they had locked him in the holding cell after the failed sale, had checked the locks and bars multiple times throughout the night. But when the auctioneer came to assess his problematic merchandise at dawn, he found the cell empty. The chains lay on the floor, still locked but somehow opened, as if they had simply decided to release their captive of their own accord. A massive search began immediately. The city watch combed through the French Quarter, checking every building and alley and cellar. Slave catchers with their dogs ranged out into the countryside, following trails that always seemed to vanish near water or stone. Posters went up offering a reward of $2,000 for information leading to his capture, describing him in detail that somehow failed to capture the essential quality of his presence. But Aurelius was not found. Days passed, then weeks, and still there was no sign of him. The story should have faded, replaced by new scandals and sensations, but instead, it grew stranger and more unsettling. People began reporting sightings of him in impossible places, standing on rooftops at midnight, walking on the river's surface at dawn, appearing in mirrors when no one should have been there. Every sighting came with the same testimony. He looked at me, and he knew everything. Celestine heard these stories with a mixture of skepticism and unease. She did not believe in ghosts or spirits, had always prided herself on her rational mind, but she could not deny that something had happened at that auction, something that transcended normal experience, and she could not deny that her own life had been fundamentally altered by it. She began, carefully and quietly, to change things at Belle Rive. She reduced the working hours in the fields. She improved the quality of food provided to the enslaved workers. She stopped separating families, a practice she had engaged in without thought whenever economic efficiency demanded it. These were small gestures, inadequate in the face of the fundamental wrong of slavery itself, but they were what she could do within the constraints of the system she inhabited, and she began to educate herself. She read abolitionist literature smuggled in from the North, writings by Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison that argued for immediate emancipation. She corresponded secretly with Quakers who ran the Underground Railroad, learning about routes and safe houses and the logistics of helping enslaved people escape to freedom. She attended clandestine meetings of free people of color who discussed strategies for resistance and liberation, listening more than speaking, trying to understand perspectives she had never bothered to consider before. Josephine watched these changes with guarded hope, neither encouraging nor discouraging them, simply bearing witness as her mistress struggled towards some new understanding of herself and her world. "You remind me of that man," she said one evening as they sat together reviewing household accounts. "Aurelius, you're looking for something you can't name. What do you think happened to him?" Celestine asked. "Do you believe he really escaped? Or do you think something else occurred?" "I think," Josephine said carefully, "that some people are born to be free. No matter what chains you put on them, their spirits can't be contained. Maybe that's what he was, a spirit of freedom that took human form for a while, to remind us of what we've lost by accepting this system." "Do you really believe that?" "Does it matter what I believe? The effect is the same either way. He's gone, and everyone who saw him has been changed. That's a kind of freedom too. The freedom to see truth, even when it's uncomfortable." Throughout New Orleans, the same conversations were happening in 1,000 different forms. The people who had been present at the auction found themselves unable to return to their previous lives unchanged. Some, like Philippe Devereaux, tried to bury the experience in denial and rage, working their slaves harder as if to prove that nothing had shifted. But others, including several prominent plantation owners, began quietly freeing their slaves, providing them with money and papers and transportation north. Judge LeBlanc retired from the bench, unable to continue sentencing people to punishments that his newly awakened conscience found abhorrent. The economic impact was significant enough that other slave owners, those who had not attended the auction and had not looked into Aurelius's eyes, began to worry. They held meetings in private clubs, discussing how to contain what they saw as a kind of moral contagion. Some argued for stricter laws against manumission. Others suggested that the whole incident was being exaggerated, that people were simply being swept up in hysteria that would pass. But the sightings continued. Every few days, someone new would report seeing Aurelius, always in a liminal space, on bridges and shorelines and thresholds, always at dawn or dusk when the world was between states, and always with that same look, that gaze that saw through all pretense to the truth beneath. Some who saw him in this way fell to their knees and wept. Others ran away, fleeing back to their homes to lock their doors and close their curtains against the knowledge they had glimpsed. Celestine saw him too, 3 months after the auction, on a morning when fog rolled in from the river thick as wool. She was walking in her garden, a space she had created with Josephine's help, planting flowers and herbs in patterns that pleased her. The sun was just beginning to break through the mist, turning everything golden and strange. When she looked up and saw him standing by the garden gate, he was dressed differently now, in clothes that seemed to shift and change as she looked at them. Sometimes the simple garments of an enslaved person, sometimes fine suits that would not have been out of place on Rue Royale, sometimes robes that suggested priests or prophets or kings. His face was exactly as she remembered, heartbreakingly beautiful and impossibly sad, and when their eyes met, she felt again that vertiginous sensation of being seen completely. "Are you real?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, and the expression transformed his face from beautiful to transcendent. "What is real? Your chains were real enough, as real as the ones you put on others. But I am free now, and that is the most real thing there is. How did you escape? Everyone is searching for you." "I didn't escape," he said gently. "I simply refuse to be contained any longer. There is a difference. Escape implies that the prison is real, that the bars have power. But I understood that the only prison that truly holds us is the one we build in our minds, the stories we tell ourselves about what is possible and what is not." Celestine took a step closer, drawn by his presence even as part of her wanted to flee. "The things I saw when you looked at me that day, are they true? Am I really as terrible as I appeared to myself in your eyes?" "I showed you nothing," Aurelius replied. "I merely held up a mirror. What you saw was your own recognition of truth you had been avoiding. And no, you are not terrible. You are human, which means you are capable of great good and great harm, often simultaneously. The question is not whether you have done wrong, because we all have. The question is what you will do with that knowledge, now that you possess it." "I've been trying," she said, hating how weak her voice sounded, how inadequate her efforts seemed when spoken aloud. "I've been trying to change things at Belle Rive. to treat the people there better, to prepare them for freedom when, if, the laws change. That is something, he acknowledged. But it is not enough, and you know it. You cannot make slavery gentle. You cannot make injustice kind. There is no ethical way to own another person, no matter how much you improve the conditions of that ownership. Then what should I do? Free them all. The law barely permits individual manumissions, and even then, only under strict conditions. If I tried to free everyone at once, the authorities would intervene, declare me incompetent, seize my property and sell everyone at auction anyway. I would accomplish nothing except my own ruin. Aurelius moved closer, and she realized that she could see through him slightly, could see the garden gate and the roses beyond, like he was made of morning mist. There are always ways, for those brave enough to find them. The Underground Railroad moves thousands to freedom every year. There are communities in the North and in Canada where people can build new lives. There are legal strategies, financial arrangements, quiet negotiations with sympathetic officials. The question is not whether paths exist, but whether you have the courage to walk them. And if I do, what then? Will I see you again? You will see me in every mirror, he said, and his voice was fading now, growing distant like an echo in a canyon. You will see me in the eyes of every person you meet, slave or free. You will see me in your own reflection when you dare to look honestly at who you are and what you have done. That is the gift I gave you at the auction, the ability to see, truly see. And once you have it, you can never lose it again. Wait, she called out, reaching toward him, but her hands closed on empty air. The fog swirled where he had stood, and then dispersed in the strengthening sunlight, leaving her alone in the garden with tears streaming down her face and a resolution crystallizing in her heart. She went back into the house and found Josephine in the kitchen, overseeing the preparation of breakfast. "Gather everyone," Celestine said. "All the house servants, all the field workers. I want everyone assembled in front of the main house in 1 hour." Josephine's eyes widened. "Madame, what are you planning?" "Ulam, something that should have been done long ago. Please, just do as I ask." An hour later, Celestine stood on the gallery of Belle Rive, looking down at the assembled people who, according to law and custom, belonged to her. 147 faces looked back at her with varying expressions of confusion, worry, and cautious hope. She had asked Josephine to ensure that everyone wore their best clothes, and the result was a sea of color that took her breath away. Bright head wraps and carefully mended shirts and dresses that had been lovingly maintained despite the brutal labor their wearers performed. She had rehearsed a speech, elegant words about conscience and morality and the changing times. But when the moment came, all those prepared phrases seemed hollow and inadequate. Instead, she spoke from the heart, from the new place in her that Aurelius had opened with his gaze. "I have gathered you here to tell you something that will change all our lives," she began, and her voice carried clearly in the still morning air. "For years, I have benefited from your labor. I have claimed ownership of your bodies, your time, your very selves. I have told myself that this was acceptable because it was legal, because it was normal, because I treated you better than others treated their slaves. These were lies I told to make myself comfortable with an uncomfortable truth. that no person has the right to own another person, and that every day I have claimed that right, I have committed a profound wrong against you and against my own humanity. A murmur ran through the crowd, shock and confusion mixing with something that might have been hope. Celestine pressed on, her hands gripping the gallery railing so hard her knuckles turned white. I cannot undo the past. I cannot give back the years I have taken from you, but I can change the future, and that is what I intend to do. Over the next months, I will be working with lawyers and officials to arrange for the manumission of every person here. The process will take time, because the laws are designed to make this difficult. But I have wealth and connections, and I will use them for this purpose. In the meantime, conditions here will change immediately. Your working hours are reduced to 6 hours per day. You will be paid wages for your labor, wages that you can save toward your future freedom. Families will not be separated under any circumstances, and anyone who wishes to leave before the legal process is complete, I will provide you with papers that may help you reach the north, and I will not pursue you or report you to the authorities. The silence that followed was absolute, as if the entire plantation held its breath. Then, from the back of the crowd, an old man named Abraham, who had been born on this land 70 years ago, raised his hand. His voice, when he spoke, trembled with age and emotion. Miss Celestine, why? Why now? What changed? Celestine met his eyes. This man, whose name she had barely known until recently, whose life she had controlled without ever really seeing him as human. I looked into the eyes of a man named Aurelius, and I saw myself truly for the first time. I saw what I had become, what this system had made me, and I decided that I could no longer live with that knowledge without acting on it. It's not enough, what I'm offering you. Nothing I do can be enough, but it's what I can do. And so, I will do it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then someone began to clap, a slow rhythmic sound that was picked up by another person, then another, until applause rolled across the assembled crowd like thunder. Some people were crying, others stood stone-faced, as if afraid to believe what they were hearing. Children clung to their parents' legs, not understanding the words, but sensing the enormity of the moment. Josephine, standing beside Celestine on the gallery, reached out and took her hand. The gesture was small, barely noticeable, but it meant everything. You may have just signed your social death warrant, she murmured. When the other plantation owners hear about this, they will destroy you. Let them try, Celestine replied. I would rather be destroyed trying to do the right thing than live comfortably doing the wrong thing. Besides, I won't be alone. There are others who attended that auction, others who looked into those eyes and saw what I saw. Some of them are changing too. Perhaps this is the beginning of something larger. The weeks that followed were among the most difficult and most rewarding of Celestine's life. True to Josephine's prediction, she was ostracized by New Orleans society. Invitations ceased. Former friends crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. Merchants refused her business. Angry letters arrived daily, some threatening violence, others predicting divine punishment for her betrayal of the natural order. The Episcopal bishop himself wrote to condemn her actions as dangerous radicalism that would lead to chaos and destruction, but she also received support from unexpected quarters. Other plantation owners who had been at the auction began reaching out privately, asking for advice on how to navigate the complex legal process of large-scale manumission. Free people of color welcomed her into their communities, offering guidance and practical help. Abolitionists from the North sent letters of encouragement and connected her with networks that could help the newly freed people establish lives beyond Louisiana. The legal process was even more difficult than she had anticipated. Louisiana law required that freed slaves leave the state within 30 days of manumission or risk being re-enslaved. This meant that Celestine had to not only secure freedom papers, but also arrange transportation and settlement assistance for over 100 people. She sold off pieces of her property, liquidated investments, spent down the fortune she had accumulated over decades, all to fund this massive undertaking. Josephine became her partner in this work, using her connections in the Black community to identify safe routes and welcoming communities in the North. Together, they coordinated with Underground Railroad conductors, arranged for employment and housing, and provided each freed family with enough money to start their new lives. The work was exhausting, dangerous, and often heartbreaking when legal obstacles or official hostility blocked their efforts. But slowly, steadily, people began to leave Belle Rive for freedom. Small groups at first, traveling under cover of night, with papers that might or might not protect them if they were stopped. Then larger groups, as Celestine became more skilled at navigating the system and more bold in her defiance of its restrictions. Each departure was celebrated with prayers and tears, with promises to write if they could, with hope and fear mingled together in equal measure. Abraham was among the last to leave. At 70 years old, he was setting out for a city he had never seen, to build a life he had never imagined possible. On the morning of his departure, he found Celestine in the study where she was working through yet another stack of legal documents. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before she noticed him. "Mr. Abraham," she said, standing quickly. She had asked all the formerly enslaved people to choose their own surnames, and Abraham had chosen Freeman, a name so simple and profound it brought tears to her eyes every time she wrote it. "Is everything ready for your journey?" "Yes, Miss Celestine. I came to say goodbye and to say thank you." "You don't need to thank me," she said, shaking her head. "I should be thanking you for your patience and grace as we worked through this process, for not hating me for all the years I held you in bondage." "I don't hate you," Abraham said simply. "Hate takes too much energy, and I'm saving my energy for freedom. But I wanted to tell you something before I go. That man, Aurelius, I saw him too." Celestine went very still. "When?" "Two, the night before he disappeared from the auction house. They had me working in the building, cleaning and preparing for the next day. I went past his cell, and he called out to me, asked me to come closer." Abraham's eyes grew distant, remembering, "I was scared at first. Everyone was scared of him by then. All the other slaves in the holding pens, but something made me go to him." "What did he say?" "He said, 'Freedom is coming, not just for you, but for thousands, millions. The chains are already broken, even if people don't know it yet. All that's left is for them to fall away.'" And then he looked at me, really looked at me the way he looked at folks in the auction house, and I saw myself, not as a slave, not as property, but as a man, a whole man, complete and worthy and free. And once I saw that, I knew I would be free someday, no matter what it took. "Do you think he was What, some kind of prophet? Abraham smiled, a gentle expression that transformed his weathered face. I think he was a man who understood freedom so deeply that he couldn't be contained by slavery, even for a moment. I think he was a reminder of what we all are underneath, before the world tells us what we're supposed to be. And I think he's still out there somewhere, looking at people and helping them see. After Abraham left, Celestine sat at her desk for a long time, thinking about freedom and sight and the strange man who had changed so many lives with nothing more than his gaze. She pulled out a letter she had received the previous week from a former slave owner in Mississippi who had also been at the auction. The man wrote about his own journey toward emancipating his slaves, about the financial and social costs, about the profound relief of finally acting in accordance with his conscience. We were all blind, the letter said. We had trained ourselves not to see, because seeing would have required action we were not brave enough to take. Aurelius gave us sight, and sight demands responsibility. There is no going back from that. She began to draft a response, but before she could finish, she heard a commotion outside. Josephine burst into the study, her face pale with fear. "Madame, there are men here, armed men. They say they have a warrant for your arrest." Celestine stood calmly, straightening her dress. "On what charges?" "Aiding fugitive slaves, inciting rebellion, conspiracy against the state." "Does it matter? They want to make an example of you. Let them come then." Celestine moved toward the door, but Josephine caught her arm. "There's a back way out. I can get you to the river, to people who will help you reach the north. You don't have to face this." "Yes, I do. If I run now, everything we've worked for will be dismissed as the actions of a criminal. But if I stand and face these charges, if I speak the truth in court, perhaps others will find courage. Besides, I'm old and tired, Josephine. I've spent most of my life doing wrong. If I can spend the end of it doing something right, even if it costs me everything, then it will have been worth it." Josephine's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "Then I'm coming with you. You won't face this alone." The trial that followed became a sensation throughout the South. Celestine was charged with multiple violations of slave codes, with conspiracy to deprive owners of their property, with inciting rebellion among the enslaved population. The prosecution brought forward plantation owners who testified that her actions had inspired unrest among their own slaves, that her radical notions threatened the entire social order. The trial was a spectacle, packed with spectators every day, with newspapers sending reporters to cover every detail. Celestine conducted her own defense, refusing to hire a lawyer because she wanted to speak in her own words. She did not deny the charges. Instead, she used the trial as a platform to argue that the laws themselves were unjust, that no legal code could make moral the owning of human beings. She spoke of Aurelius, of his eyes and what they had shown her, of the moment when she had been forced to confront the truth of her own complicity in a system of profound evil. "You ask me if I violated the law," she said in her final statement to the jury. "I did, proudly and deliberately, because there are times when the law itself is wrong, when obedience to it makes us complicit in atrocity. You can convict me, and I expect you will. You can imprison me or execute me, but you cannot make me believe that what I did was wrong. I saw a man named Aurelius, and he helped me see myself. That sight saved my soul, even if it costs me my freedom or my life." The jury deliberated for less than an hour before finding her guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced her to 15 years hard labor, a sentence that for a woman of her age amounted to a death sentence. As the bailiff led her away, she looked back at Josephine, who sat weeping in the gallery, and smiled. It was a genuine smile, peaceful and even joyful, the smile of someone who had finally found the courage to live according to her deepest values. Celestine served 3 years of her sentence before dying of pneumonia in a prison designed more to punish than to rehabilitate. But in those 3 years, she became a symbol for the growing abolitionist movement. Her trial transcript was reprinted in newspapers across the North. Her letters from prison, smuggled out and published, inspired others to take action against slavery. She became, in death, more powerful than she had ever been in life, a martyr whose story demonstrated that it was possible for people to change, to grow, to reject the sins of their past, and embrace a more just future. Josephine lived to see the end of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery. She used the money Celestine had given her to open a school for formerly enslaved children, teaching them to read and write and think for themselves. She never married, never had children of her own, beyond the hundreds of students who passed through her classroom over the years. And she never found her daughter, despite decades of searching. But she kept looking until the day she died at 87, still hoping for a reunion that never came. As for Aurelius, the sightings continued for years after that infamous auction. People reported seeing him at anti-slavery meetings, standing silent at the back of the room, while speakers condemned the peculiar institution. Others swore they saw him on battlefields during the Civil War, walking among the wounded without regard for which side they fought on, offering comfort with his presence if not his words. Harriet Tubman herself claimed to have seen him once on the Underground Railroad, guiding a group of freedom seekers through treacherous terrain, vanishing at dawn like mist in sunlight. Some believed he was real, a freedom fighter who had escaped slavery and devoted his life to helping others do the same. Others thought he was a legend that had grown from that single moment at the auction, a collective symbol of the enslaved people's unbreakable spirit. And still others believed he was something more, a spirit or angel or force of nature that took human shape to remind people of truths they would rather forget. The truth, as always, was both simpler and more complex than any single explanation could capture. Aurelius had been a man, born into slavery, educated in secret, possessed of a beauty that transcended physical form to touch something essential in those who saw him. He had understood, with a clarity that most people never achieve, that freedom is not something granted by others, but something inherent in the human spirit, something that can be suppressed but never truly destroyed. And he had used that understanding, along with his remarkable appearance, to force a confrontation with truth that changed lives and helped change a nation. In New Orleans, long after the war ended and slavery was abolished, people still spoke of the auction that never happened, of the man whose gaze could not be endured, of the chains that opened themselves in the night. The story became part of the city's folklore, told and retold with variations and embellishments, a reminder of the time when truth became visible and people had to choose what to do with that visibility. And sometimes, even now, people report seeing him, usually at liminal times and places, at dawn or dusk, on bridges or thresholds, in mirrors when the light falls just right. They say he still looks at you with those knowing eyes, still sees through all pretense to the truth beneath, still asks without words the question that Celestine's husband asked. What will you say? What will you say when you stand before truth and cannot hide from it anymore? Most people look away, unwilling or unable to confront what his gaze reveals. But some, a precious few, meet his eyes and see themselves truly, in all their flawed and complex humanity, capable of both good and evil, shaped by their choices and their willingness to change. Those people are marked by the encounter, changed in ways they can barely articulate, carrying forward that vision of truth into their daily lives and spreading it through their actions and their words. The legacy of that single moment at the auction house in 1851 rippled outward through time in ways that no one could have predicted. It was not the only factor in slavery's eventual abolition, certainly, but it was part of a larger awakening, a growing recognition that the system was fundamentally wrong and could not be reformed or made humane. Every person who attended that auction and later freed their slaves, every child of those people who grew up with a different understanding of justice, every friend and neighbor influenced by their example, all of these represented threads in a vast web of change that eventually transformed the nation. But beyond its historical impact, the story of Aurelius resonates because it speaks to something universal: the power of truth to transform, the courage required to see clearly and act on that seeing, the possibility of redemption even for those complicit in great wrong. Celestine Beaumont was not a hero in the traditional sense. She spent most of her life as a willing participant in one of humanity's greatest crimes. But in the end, she found the strength to change, to sacrifice comfort and status and freedom itself in pursuit of justice. That transformation, painful and incomplete as it was, offers hope that people can grow beyond their worst selves, that conscience can be awakened even after decades of sleep. And that, perhaps, is the true meaning of Aurelius's vanishing. He did not escape in the conventional sense, through cunning or violence or luck. He simply ceased to be constrained, refused at a fundamental level to accept the boundaries that society tried to impose on him. His chains opened because he understood that they were never truly locked, that the only prison that matters is the one we build in our minds from fear and convention and the stories we tell ourselves about what is possible. The final recorded sighting of Aurelius came in 1903, more than 50 years after the auction. An old woman named Marie, who had been born into slavery but lived to see freedom, reported meeting him on the banks of the Mississippi River at dawn. She had gone there to scatter flowers in memory of her mother, who had died in bondage and been buried in an unmarked grave. The rising sun turned the water gold, and there he stood, looking exactly as he had in the stories she'd heard as a child. "Are you real?" she asked him, echoing the question Celestine had posed decades before. He smiled that transcendent smile and replied, "Are you? What is real, except what we choose to believe and act upon? Your mother is free now, free in ways that death alone could not grant her, and you are free, not just legally, but in your spirit, because you understand what freedom truly means. That is real. Everything else is shadow. Will I see you again? You see me every time you look at someone and recognize their full humanity. Every time you act from conscience rather than convenience. Every time you choose truth over comfortable lies. I am not one man, Marie. I am the part of every person that yearns for freedom, the voice that says no to injustice, the strength that breaks chains both visible and invisible. As long as people seek truth and justice and liberation, I will be there. I am always there. And then, like all the times before, he was gone, dissolving into morning light and river mist, leaving Marie alone on the shore with her flowers and her memories and the unshakable conviction that she had met something precious and true, something that would stay with her until her own death, and perhaps beyond. The story of the most beautiful slave ever sold in New Orleans, the man no one could bear to look at, ends not with answers, but with questions. What does it mean to be free? How do we find the courage to see truth when truth demands that we change? Can people transcend their worst impulses and the worst systems they inhabit? These questions remain alive today, as urgent and necessary as they were in 1851, because the human capacity for both evil and redemption has not changed, only the specific forms that capacity takes. Aurelius, whether man or myth or something in between, stands as a permanent reminder that our chains are ultimately of our own making, that the courage to break them comes from seeing ourselves clearly, and that such seeing, while painful, is the only path to true freedom. His eyes, those remarkable eyes that people could not bear to meet, reflected nothing except truth, and truth is always the most powerful force for change, even when, especially when, it costs us everything we thought we wanted to hold. In the archives of New Orleans, in the records of that failed auction and the trial that followed, historians can find the factual skeleton of this story, but the truth of it, the real truth, lives in the hearts of everyone who has ever looked in a mirror and seen themselves clearly, who has ever chosen conscience over comfort, who has ever understood that freedom is not something given or taken, but something recognized, claimed, and lived. That truth cannot be contained in documents or confined to the past. It remains alive, urgent, demanding, asking each of us the same question it asked Celestine Beaumont and everyone else who met that knowing gaze. What will you say? What will you do when you can no longer hide from what you know to be true? The impact of that day continued to spread through New Orleans society like roots through soil, invisible but transformative. In the months following the auction, several other significant figures found their lives irreversibly altered by their encounter with Aurelius. Among them was Dr. Laurent Mercier, a prominent physician who had attended the auction out of curiosity and left it a changed man. He had built his practice treating the wealthy families of the Garden District, families whose fortunes rested entirely on the labor of enslaved people, and he had never questioned the moral foundations of his own prosperity. Dr. Mercier had stood near the back of the auction house that day, his medical eye initially cataloging Aurelius's physical perfection with clinical detachment, perfect bone structure, ideal proportions, skin without blemish or scar, the body of a classical statue brought to life. But when those eyes found him in the crowd, his clinical distance evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. In that moment of connection, he saw himself not as a healer, but as an accomplice, a man who had treated the wounds of enslaved people only to send them back to the conditions that caused those wounds, who had delivered babies into bondage and set broken bones so that their owners could extract more labor from them. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had taken the Hippocratic Oath, had sworn to do no harm, yet his entire practice was built on a system of profound and systematic harm. He thought of the young woman who had come to him just last week, beaten so severely by her master that she could barely walk, and how he had treated her injuries and sent her back without a word of protest or intervention. He thought of the countless times he had looked away from evidence of abuse, had accepted explanations that were obvious lies, had prioritized the comfort of his wealthy clients over the welfare of their victims. In the weeks after the auction, Dr. Mercier found himself unable to continue his practice as before. He began refusing to treat plantation owners unless they agreed to his presence during their interactions with enslaved workers, documenting instances of abuse and threatening to testify against them if they did not reform their treatment. His wealthy clients abandoned him in droves, scandalized by his new insistence on ethical standards that they found incomprehensible and offensive. His income plummeted, his social standing collapsed, and his wife left him, unable to bear the shame of being married to a man who had become a pariah. But he found new purpose in treating the free people of color and the enslaved population directly, opening a clinic in a part of the city where respectable doctors never ventured. He worked without payment most days, accepting whatever his patients could offer, whether that was a basket of eggs or a hand-sewn shirt or simply their gratitude. And he began documenting the medical evidence of slavery's cruelty, keeping detailed records of injuries and illnesses that could be traced directly to the conditions of bondage, building a case that he hoped would one day be used to condemn the institution itself. On a humid evening in July, nearly a year after the auction, Dr. Mercier was treating a young boy who had been struck by his overseer when a figure appeared in the doorway of his clinic. The doctor looked up, wiping sweat from his forehead, and felt his heart seize in his chest. Aurelius stood there, dressed in simple clothes that seemed to shimmer in the lamplight, his face as serene and beautiful as Mercier remembered. "You," the doctor whispered, his hands going still on the bandage he was wrapping. "They said you vanished. Where have you been?" Aurelius stepped into the clinic, moving with a grace that seemed almost inhuman. "I have been everywhere and nowhere. I have been with those who needed to see, helping them find the courage to look, and now I am here, because you have earned a moment of my time through your actions. I don't understand. I only did what anyone with a conscience should do, but most do not," Aurelius replied, kneeling beside the boy and placing one hand gently on the child's head. The boy, who had been crying from pain, suddenly went quiet, his eyes widening as he looked at this strange visitor. Most people, when confronted with truth, turn away from it. They find ways to justify their comfort, to explain away their complicity. You did not. When I showed you what you were, you did not hide from it or make excuses. You changed. Dr. Mercier felt tears pricking at his eyes, though he could not have said exactly why. "I lost everything. My practice, my marriage, my standing in society. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice, if my sacrifice has accomplished anything meaningful." "You saved lives," Aurelius said simply, gesturing around the humble clinic with its mismatched furniture and scarce supplies. "How many people have you treated here? How many have you documented their suffering, giving voice to pain that society prefers to ignore? You think your sacrifice was meaningless because you cannot see the full extent of its impact. But I can see it. Every person you help, Every record you keep, every small act of defiance against injustice sends ripples through the world. Those ripples will reach shores you will never see, but they are real, nonetheless. The young boy reached out and touched Aurelius's face with one small hand, a gesture of such innocent trust that it made both men catch their breath. "Are you an angel?" the child asked in a voice barely above a whisper. Aurelius smiled, and the expression transformed the already beautiful face into something that belonged to dreams or visions. "I am whatever you need me to be. To some, I am a mirror. To others, I am a guide. To you, small one, I am simply someone who sees you, truly sees you, and knows that you are worthy of love and freedom and all the good things this world has to offer." "Will I be free someday?" the boy asked, and the question hung in the air like a prayer. "Yes," Aurelius said with absolute certainty. "Not today, and not tomorrow, but yes, freedom is coming like a storm, and it will sweep away chains and auction blocks and all the structures built on stolen lives. You will live to see it, little one. Hold that knowledge in your heart during the dark times, and let it give you strength." Dr. Mercier watched this exchange with wonder, seeing how the boy's face transformed from pain and fear to hope and peace. When Aurelius finally stood to leave, the doctor followed him to the door. "Will I see you again?" he asked. "You see me every day," Aurelius replied, pausing at the threshold. "Every time you choose compassion over comfort, every time you document truth that others want hidden, every time you treat the least of these as you would treat the greatest, you see me, because I am not separate from the work you do, Dr. Mercier. I am the spirit that animates it, the conviction that drives it, the hope that sustains it. As long as you continue to choose justice, I will be with you." And then he was gone, leaving the doctor standing in the doorway with the boy's quiet breathing behind him and the sounds of the city all around. Dr. Mercier returned to his patient, finishing the bandaging with hands that were steadier now, filled with a renewed sense of purpose that would carry him through the difficult years ahead. Another person profoundly affected by Aurelius was Father Sebastian Moreau, a Catholic priest who served a parish in the French Quarter. Father Moreau had been at the auction at the invitation of one of his wealthier parishioners, a woman who wanted his blessing on her purchase of a house servant. He had attended reluctantly, uncomfortable with the entire proceeding but unable to articulate why, given that the church itself had never explicitly condemned slavery and many of its clergy owned slaves themselves. When Aurelius appeared on that platform, Father Moreau felt something shift deep in his soul, a tectonic movement of belief and understanding that would reshape the landscape of his faith forever. The priest was a man who prided himself on his theological education, his understanding of scripture and church doctrine, his ability to provide spiritual guidance to his flock. But in that moment, looking into Aurelius's eyes, he realized that all his learning had been a kind of blindness, a way of avoiding direct confrontation with the simple truth that every human being is made in the image of God and therefore cannot be property. He had rationalized slavery through carefully selected Bible verses, through appeals to social order and cultural tradition, through the comfortable fiction that the church's role was to soften slavery's harsh edges rather than condemn the institution itself. But Aurelius's gaze burned through all those rationalizations like fire through dry paper, leaving only the essential question: how can you claim to follow a God who commanded love of neighbor while participating in a system that treats neighbors as commodities? Father Moreau left the auction house in a state of spiritual crisis. He returned to his parish church and knelt before the altar, praying for guidance with an intensity he had not felt since his seminary days. What emerged from that prayer was a conviction so strong it could not be denied. He had to speak out, regardless of the consequences. The following Sunday, he delivered a sermon that shocked his congregation to its core. Standing in the pulpit before the assembled wealthy families of the quarter, he denounced slavery as a sin against God and man, a violation of every principle Christ had taught. He spoke of Aurelius, though he did not name him, describing the moment when he had been forced to see truth clearly and could no longer hide behind theological sophistry. "We have made God in our own image," Father Moreau thundered, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the church. "We have twisted Scripture to justify our comfort and our wealth. We have taken the message of liberation that Christ brought to the world and turned it into chains. But I tell you now, with absolute certainty, that no person can own another person and remain in right relationship with God. We must repent of this sin. We must work to dismantle this system. We must choose justice over tradition, even if it costs us everything we think we value." The reaction was swift and severe. Within a week, Father Moreau was removed from his parish by the Archbishop, who cited his inflammatory rhetoric and departure from church teaching as grounds for dismissal. He was forbidden from serving as a priest in any Louisiana parish, effectively ending his career in the only profession he had ever known. His family disowned him. His former parishioners, many of whom had once sought his counsel and valued his friendship, now treated him as a dangerous radical whose ideas threatened the foundations of their society. But Father Moreau did not stop preaching. He took his message to the streets, to anyone who would listen, free people of color and poor whites, and even enslaved people when he could reach them safely. He became known as the heretic priest, a figure who haunted the edges of respectable society, speaking uncomfortable truths that could not be entirely silenced because they resonated with something deep in the human conscience. On a cold night in December, 2 years after the auction, Father Moreau was conducting a secret prayer service for a group of enslaved people in an abandoned warehouse near the docks. He had just finished reading from the Gospel according to Luke, the passage where Jesus declares that he has come to set the captives free, when he noticed a figure standing at the edge of the gathered group. Even in the dim light of their few candles, he recognized Aurelius immediately. After the service ended and the worshippers had slipped away into the night, Aurelius approached the priest. Father Moreau felt again that sensation of being seen completely, stripped of all pretense and self-deception, reduced to his essential truth. But this time, instead of fear or shame, he felt only a deep peace, the peace that comes from living in alignment with one's deepest convictions. "You gave up everything," Aurelius said, and it was not a question, but an acknowledgement. "I gave up nothing that mattered," Father Moreau replied. "I thought I was sacrificing my calling, but I realize now that I finally found it. All those years in the pulpit, preaching comfortable sermons to comfortable people, I was asleep. You woke me up. That day at the auction, you woke me up, and I cannot go back to sleep. Do you regret it? The loss of your position, your status, your security?" Father Moreau considered the question carefully, looking around the cold warehouse that had become his makeshift church. "Sometimes, in my weakest moments, I long for the warmth of my old rectory, the respect I once commanded, the certainty that I was doing what was expected of me. But then I remember the faces of the people who come to these services, hungry for a gospel that affirms their humanity, desperate for spiritual sustenance that doesn't come with chains attached. And I know that this is where Christ would be, here with the least of these, not in the comfortable pews of the wealthy. Aurelius placed a hand on the priest's shoulder, and Father Moreau felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with physical temperature. You understand now what I tried to show everyone at the auction, that true freedom begins when we stop lying to ourselves, when we face the truth of what we are and what we have done, and when we choose to act differently, despite the cost. You are free now, Father Moreau. Free in a way that all your theological learning could never provide. Will the others understand? The ones who saw you that day, but have not changed, will they ever see what I see? Some will not. Change happens at different speeds for different people, but every person who chooses truth over comfort makes it easier for the next person to do the same. You are not alone in this work, though it may feel that way. There are others, more every day, who are finding the courage to reject a system they once accepted without question. Together, you are building something new, even as the old world fights to maintain itself. Father Moreau thought of Celestine Beaumont, imprisoned for her refusal to stop helping enslaved people escape. He thought of Dr. Mercier, working in his humble clinic. He thought of all the others he had heard about, plantation owners who had freed their slaves, merchants who had refused to profit from the slave trade, ordinary people who had made extraordinary choices because they could no longer live with their complicity. We are a community, he said wonderingly, scattered across the city and beyond, but connected by what we saw in your eyes. You are connected by truth, Aurelius corrected gently. I simply helped you see it. The power was always within you, within all of you, to reject injustice and choose a better way. My role was only to remove the veils that prevented you from seeing clearly. What you do with that clear sight is up to you. As Aurelius turned to leave, Father Moreau called out, "Wait, tell me, are you truly just a man, or are you something more? Some agent of divine will sent to test us or save us?" Aurelius paused, his silhouette backlit by the moonlight coming through the warehouse's broken windows. I am a man who refuses to accept chains, who sees freedom not as a privilege granted by others, but as an inherent right of all human beings. If that makes me divine, then divinity is within everyone, waiting to be claimed. The question is not what I am, Father Moreau. The question is what you will become now that you have seen the truth. Will you grow into that vision, or will you shrink back into comfortable lies? I will grow, Father Moreau said firmly. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, I will grow. Then you will see me again, Aurelius promised. Perhaps not in this form, but in every act of courage, every moment of truth-telling, every choice to love justice more than comfort. I am always there. In those moments, I am the part of you that knows right from wrong and refuses to compromise. Years later, when the Civil War finally came and the nation tore itself apart over the question of slavery, Father Moreau would still be preaching his message of liberation and justice. He would serve as a chaplain to black troops fighting for the Union, would help establish schools for formerly enslaved children after emancipation, would live to see many of the changes he had worked toward become reality. And throughout all of it, In his moments of doubt and exhaustion and fear, he would remember that night in the warehouse, would remember Aurelius's words and the warmth of his touch, and would find the strength to continue. The story of Aurelius became intertwined with the larger story of New Orleans itself, a city built on contradictions, where French and Spanish and African and American cultures mixed and clashed, where free people of color navigated a complex social hierarchy that granted them some rights while denying them others, where great beauty and great cruelty existed side by side in the same streets, and sometimes in the same hearts. The auction that never happened became part of the city's mythology, referenced in songs and stories, whispered about in taverns and ballrooms, a shared memory that meant different things to different people, but could never be entirely forgotten or dismissed. Some of the plantation owners who had been at the auction doubled down on their beliefs, working even harder to maintain the system that Aurelius had challenged. They formed societies dedicated to defending slavery as a positive good, published pamphlets arguing that black people were better off enslaved than free, used violence and intimidation to silence dissent. But even these fierce defenders of the old order could not escape what they had seen. In private moments, in the darkness before sleep, they remembered those eyes and the truths they had revealed, and no amount of bluster or denial could completely erase that memory. The enslaved population of New Orleans heard about Aurelius through their own networks of communication, the hidden channels through which information flowed despite every effort to control it. To them, he became a symbol of resistance and hope, proof that the spirit could not be chained, even when the body was bound. Songs were created about him, spirituals that spoke in coded language about a man who could not be held, who walked through walls and vanished like smoke, who would return someday to break all chains. Children born into slavery after 1851 were told stories about Aurelius as lessons in dignity and resistance, taught that no matter what the world said about them, they possessed an inherent worth that could not be diminished by bondage. And so the ripples continued to spread, touching lives in ways both large and small, contributing to the growing tension that would eventually erupt into war and transformation. The auction that never happened became a catalyst. Not the only one, certainly, but a significant one. A moment when truth became visible in a way that could not be ignored or easily forgotten. Aurelius himself, whether flesh or spirit or symbol or all three, remained an enigma, appearing at crucial moments to people who needed to see, always with that same knowing gaze, always asking the same silent question: what will you do with the truth you can no longer deny? In the end, his greatest gift was not freedom itself, though many who encountered him eventually found their way to it, but the ability to see clearly, to strip away the comfortable lies and face reality without flinching. That kind of sight is its own form of liberation, because once you truly see, once you really understand the weight of injustice and your own role in maintaining it, you can never go back to sleep. You can try. Many people try, but the clarity remains like a light behind your eyes, illuminating everything you see and do, demanding that you live with integrity even when integrity is costly. The most beautiful slave ever sold in New Orleans was never actually sold. And perhaps that was the point all along, to demonstrate that some things cannot be bought or sold, that human dignity and worth transcend any economic system designed to reduce people to commodities. Aurelius stood on that platform for only a few minutes, but in those minutes, He accomplished what years of preaching and political argument had failed to achieve. He made people see, really see, the fundamental wrongness of slavery. And in that seeing, he planted seeds of change that would grow slowly but inexorably toward a different future, a future where all chains, both visible and invisible, might finally be broken.